June 18, 1874. Red Canyon Territory, American Southwest. The wind cut through the narrow corridors of Red Canyon like something alive. It was late afternoon when cartographer Elias Mercer stopped walking. His horse, worn down by the uneven terrain, stood breathing heavily behind him, while the rest of the expedition moved on ahead, their silhouettes vanishing one by one between walls of red sandstone that rose on either side like the remains of something broken. Mercer didn't follow. Instead, he stood there, staring at a formation in the rock that didn't match anything in his field guides. He opened his leather-bound survey journal, pages already filled with coordinate grids, elevation sketches, compass readings, and for several seconds, he simply didn't write. Then he began to draw, slowly, deliberately. What he sketched would later be described in official records as inconsistent with known topography of the region. But Mercer himself wrote something different beneath the drawing. Section not represented in prior surveys. Geometry suggests intentional formation. That line would become one of the last coherent entries anyone ever attributed to him. 2 days later, the expedition returned to base camp without Elias Mercer. And his final page was gone, not torn, not damaged, removed with what later witnesses would call surgical precision. No explanation ever made it into the official military report. No follow-up investigation appears anywhere in the final expedition archive. And the section of canyon Mercer had insisted on mapping was quietly dropped from every official map that came after. This isn't just the story of a missing man. It's the story of what the United States Army chose not to map, and why one missing page from a cartographer's notebook would go on to become one of the most persistent anomalies in 19th century frontier documentation. Because Mercer wasn't some green surveyor fresh off a train. He was one of the most precise field cartographers assigned to Western expeditions during that period. His work had already been used to correct official territorial boundaries. His coordinate logs were trusted enough to be folded directly into federal mapping revisions. If Mercer said something was there, it was usually there. Which is exactly why his disappearance was never treated as an ordinary loss, at least not by the people who actually worked with him. In 1874, though, the official story moved fast. Too fast. The report submitted to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers made no mention of unusual formations, no mention of personnel lost under suspicious circumstances, and no mention of the missing final page. The conclusion was a single clean sentence. Survey completed with standard geological variations observed. Nothing more. But buried in correspondence that never reached public circulation, a different tone starts to show up. One letter, written by Lieutenant Harold Whitmore, who commanded the expedition's military escort, contains a line that would later catch the attention of independent researchers. Cartographer Mercer insisted the canyon extends beyond recorded geography. His final sketches were not submitted, not lost, not destroyed, withheld. To understand why that single word matters, you have to understand what Red Canyon meant to the Army in 1874. The American Southwest was still being actively surveyed, divided, and claimed. Military cartographers weren't just drawing pretty maps. They were defining ownership, navigation routes, and strategic control. A missing canyon wasn't a paperwork oversight. It was a gap in control. Red Canyon had been partially mapped before by fur traders and railroad scouts, but their records didn't agree with each other. Some showed a narrow pass. Others showed a fragmented system of ravines. None of them matched what Mercer eventually recorded, because according to his surviving notes, the canyon wasn't just bigger than anyone expected. It was structured. That word shows up again and again in the fragmented copies of his journal that survive today in private collections. Not carved by erosion, not shaped by water. Structured. That's the word where this stops being a story about geography and starts being something much harder to classify. The expedition itself was 12 men, 3 cartographers, 5 military escorts, 2 geological assistants, and 2 civilian guides who knew the old trade routes through the canyon. They went in from the eastern ridge in early June of 1874, with orders to finish a full topographical survey before the summer mapping season ended. The first week, nothing unusual. Daily logs describe ordinary terrain changes, tight water access, normal elevation shifts. Then, on the 8th day, Mercer's notes change. He starts writing about unmapped discontinuities in the canyon walls. And then something stranger appears in the record, a missing day. There are no entries at all for June 15, 1874. The official archive calls it lost documentation due to field conditions. But full missing days were rare in military survey work of that period, and rarer still from a cartographer as disciplined as Mercer. Which leaves two possibilities. Either those notes were never written, or they were taken out on purpose. By the time the team reached the western fork of the canyon, Mercer had pulled away from the rest of the group. Assistant Surveyor Daniel Hargrove later testified that Mercer kept asking to push the mapping lines past their agreed boundary, telling him flatly, "The canyon does not end where the ridge suggests it should." Hargrove chalked it up to fatigue at first, but Mercer kept going, mapping areas that weren't on the schedule, areas that didn't appear on any earlier reconnaissance chart, areas that, by every official map in existence, shouldn't have needed mapping at all. Then came June 18th. Mercer got permission to break off from the group for what he called final coordinate verification along the northern ridge. He was due back by dusk. He never came back. When the escort retraced his route, they found his equipment sitting exactly where he'd left it. His compass, his measuring chain, his notebook. But the final page had been removed, cleanly, as if it had never been attached at all. And what remained of his sketches showed something no official report would ever touch directly. Geometry that didn't match natural canyon formations. Lines suggesting continuity, as if Red Canyon wasn't a collection of separate geological features at all, but a single connected structure that reached far past where the maps said it should end. The morning after Mercer vanished, the expedition did something almost unheard of for a military survey unit in 1874. They didn't search. Instead, they held their position at the Eastern Ridge camp and waited for word from Fort Reynolds, the command post responsible for coordinating territorial surveys in the region. That delay would become one of the most scrutinized decisions in the entire case, because standard protocol treated the loss of a key cartographer as a field emergency. Search parties were supposed to go out within hours. Here, nearly a full day passed before anyone organized a sweep of the canyon floor. By then, the wind had already reshaped the sand. Whatever trail Mercer might have left was gone. Years later, a retired quartermaster who had served briefly at Fort Reynolds gave a brief statement to a regional historian, recalling that the delay order had come directly from the fort, not from Whitmore's own discretion in the field. He couldn't remember who signed it. He only remembered that it arrived by rider late in the night, and that the escort unit seemed unsettled by it, as if the order itself had been expected somehow before anyone in the canyon had even reported Mercer missing. When the search finally started, the first real discovery wasn't out in the canyon. It was back at Mercer's abandoned field station, and what they found there was stranger than an empty camp. His equipment had been arranged, carefully, too carefully. The compass sat aligned due north. The measuring chains were coiled into a perfect loop. The ink bottle was sealed and standing upright beside the journal, like a desk left tidy at the end of a workday. It didn't look like the aftermath of panic. It looked staged, as if someone had come back to the site after Mercer disappeared and reset everything by hand. Lieutenant Whitmore wrote that observation down in a private field note. It never made it into the official expedition summary, and it raises the first real contradiction in the case. If Mercer had simply fallen, gotten lost, or been taken by the terrain, why was his equipment arranged like that? The recovered journal became the heart of the investigation, but only part of it, because the most important page, the one where Mercer had been mapping the northern extension of the canyon, was already gone before the notebook was even cataloged. Geological assistant Daniel Hargrove was given the task of inventorying what remained, page by page, against the expedition's original supply log. He noted the binding was intact. He noted the cover showed no signs of tampering. And he noted, almost in passing, that the final stitching at the spine looked freshly cut, not torn along an existing seam, the way a page comes loose with wear, but sliced clean with something sharp enough to leave a straight edge. That detail sat in his private notes for years before anyone outside the expedition ever read it. What did survive was enough to worry the expedition's geological assistants. Mercer had drawn overlapping contour lines that matched nothing in any known survey of the region and annotated one section with a phrase that keeps turning up in fragmented copies of his journal held in private archives: void between mapped ridges. That phrase doesn't exist anywhere in the standard surveying language of the period. It isn't a recognized classification. It reads like a man trying to describe something his own professional vocabulary couldn't quite hold. 2 days into the search, a second discovery turned up about half a mile north of the main canyon route. A shallow excavation site, fresh soil disturbance, and tool marks that didn't match any equipment issued to the expedition. Lieutenant Whitmore described it in his notes as deliberate digging in compact sediment layers beneath exposed sandstone cover. At the center of the site, they found fragments of stone that had clearly been pulled from beneath the surface. Not exposed by weather or erosion, but extracted on purpose. Someone had been digging beneath Red Canyon. No one in the expedition admitted to it, and Mercer was the only man missing. This is where the official record starts to come apart at the seams. The Army Corps report flatly states that no evidence of unauthorized excavation was found at the site. But Whitmore's private correspondence, recovered decades later from a family archive, long after his death, tells a very different story. Subsurface stone appears cut in linear formations inconsistent with erosion or natural fracturing. Mercer believed these formations were intentional. Intentional. One word, and it changes everything about how you have to read this site. Because if Mercer was right, Red Canyon wasn't simply a geological formation. It had internal design, something that, by every rule of natural sedimentary geology in that region, shouldn't exist at all. As the search dragged on, the tension inside the unit started to show. The civilian guides refused to re-enter certain corridors of the canyon, insisting the terrain felt wrong in ways they couldn't quite put into words. One of them walked off the expedition entirely on the third day, heading back east without anyone's formal permission. His departure never made it into the final report. Only his absence did. Then came the second real anomaly. On the fourth day after Mercer disappeared, a partial map turned up inside his field satchel. Not the missing final page, but an earlier draft. And it showed something nobody expected: the canyon continuing well past its known western boundary, not narrowing into a dead end, the way every existing chart said it should. Widening. Opening into a formation Mercer had labeled, in his own hand, the continuity corridor. That phrase would later become central to every modern attempt to make sense of this case, because it contradicts every geological survey of the region conducted from the late 19th century onward. No official map has ever confirmed a formation like it exists, and yet Mercer's coordinates were precise, too precise to wave off as a simple mistake. Run through modern mapping overlays, they point to a stretch of terrain that's still classified, even today, as a non-continuous erosion zone. Technically unremarkable, but never fully reconciled at the finer scales of elevation mapping. A gap that has simply never closed. By the fifth day, the Army officially scaled the search back, citing environmental hazard conditions and diminishing probability of survival. But internal correspondence tells a different story, a concern that further digging might turn up more undocumented findings, the kind that would complicate territorial maps already on their way to federal approval. In plain terms, the search for Elias Mercer had stopped being a rescue operation. It had become a liability. The expedition was ordered to seal Mercer's journal and return to Fort Reynolds. No further excavation, no further mapping of the northern ridge. The missing final page was never recovered. But what happened after the expedition got home is what actually turned this into the case historians still argue about today. When Mercer's incomplete journal reached the mapping office for processing, it was logged, reviewed, and then quietly reclassified under a restricted survey category. The official reason was never disclosed. All that survives is a short notation in the archive index. Unverified topographical extension beyond accepted territorial grid. And beneath it, one final line that would go on to define the entire mystery for generations of researchers who came after. Page removed prior to cartographic integration. By the winter of 1875, the Red Canyon expedition had already faded out of active military discussion. Officially, it was a completed territorial survey with one unresolved personnel loss. Unofficially, the case of Elias Mercer sat in a very different category inside the archives at Fort Reynolds. Not solved, not closed, just contained. His journal went into a restricted documentation file. His name was entered into the personnel logs as presumed lost in field conditions, and Red Canyon itself was folded quietly into later territorial maps that no longer reflected any of the strange extensions Mercer had tried so hard to document. But the most important change wasn't what showed up on those later maps. It was what vanished from them. The region Mercer had labeled the Continuity Corridor was never again included in any official survey as a distinct geological feature. On paper, it simply stopped being a problem that needed mapping at all. It took until 1881 for anyone to notice. A junior cartographer cross-referencing old expedition logs against updated territorial charts spotted a gap, not in the geography this time, but in the paperwork itself. Several entries referenced Mercer's final field page, but no physical document matching them existed anywhere in the archive. One line read, "Final sketch sheet retained for review." The next dated only days later. Sheet removed for cartographic reconciliation. No signature, no officer identified, no explanation ever attached. To modern historians, that gap is one of the most telling details in the entire case, because military record-keeping of that era almost never allowed for unrecorded document removal. Even lost paperwork got marked as lost. Mercer's final page wasn't labeled lost. It was labeled processed, which means someone saw it, evaluated it, and chose deliberately to take it out of the official record. By the late 1800s, Red Canyon had slipped into the category of a secondary survey region. The railroads bypassed it. New settlements went up farther east. Military interest moved on to corridors that actually mattered strategically, but the occasional civilian survey still passed through. And in 1893, one of them produced a strange little footnote that almost no one ever read. A geological assistant named Thomas Keeling wrote, "Certain canyon walls appear discontinuous when viewed from elevated ridge alignment. Mapping discrepancy persists between observed structure and recorded topography." That line never made it into the final published survey. It survives only in an internal draft, and it echoes Mercer's own language so closely it's hard to call it a coincidence. This is where the case stops being about one missing cartographer and starts being about a pattern. Mercer wasn't the only person to notice something off about Red Canyon's structure. He was just the first to write it down in a military file. Later records suggest that over 2 decades, several different surveyors ran into the same kind of anomalies. Lines that wouldn't converge, ridges that looked continuous from one angle and fractured from another, elevation readings that shifted depending on which direction you approached from. On their own, any one of those is a measurement error, easily explained. Stacked together across 2 decades and multiple independent observers, they start to look like something else. A mapping inconsistency baked into the terrain itself. Modern geology offers a reasonable explanation. Red Canyon sits inside a heavily eroded sandstone system, shaped by millions of years of sediment, uplift, and wind. In terrain like that, shadow layering and perspective distortion really can create the illusion of structure where none exists. But that explanation has a hole in it, because Mercer never described an illusion. He described geometry, angles in his own words, that repeated across separated ridges. Taken literally, that's not an optical trick. That's pattern repetition across formations that shouldn't share any pattern at all. It's not the kind of uniformity erosion tends to produce. And then there's the missing page itself, the one piece of physical evidence that could have settled the question either way. Several secondary witnesses at Fort Reynolds later said they'd seen Mercer's final sheet before it disappeared into the archive. One described a continuous line system extending beyond mapped canyon boundaries. Another remembered a shaded section marked as unverified interior terrain. Neither account exists in any official document. Both surfaced only as personal recollections, recorded decades after the fact, the kind of memory that's easy to dismiss and hard to fully discount. But both witnesses agreed on the only thing that actually matters here. The page existed, and then it didn't. No one has ever offered a definitive explanation for where it went. Some historians think it was simply cut for cartographic accuracy, a flawed sketch pulled before it could end up on an official map. Others think it was removed to keep territorial documentation clean during a period when the Army badly needed clean paperwork. A smaller, more unsettling theory holds that Mercer had documented something that didn't fit the geographic classifications already in use, and that the simplest fix wasn't correction. It was omission. What's beyond dispute is this. Red Canyon, as Mercer recorded it, doesn't fully line up with Red Canyon as it appears on modern official maps. There are small, measurable differences in contour alignment between his 19th century drafts and later standardized surveys. Small, but consistent enough to be statistically notable, not enough to prove anything. And that, more than any single clue in the case, is exactly why it's lasted as long as it has, because it sits precisely in the gap between error and intention, between data that was lost and data that was taken, between a cartographer who walked north along a ridge one afternoon in 1874 and never came back, and a missing page that no archive, in over 150 years, has ever fully accounted for. Today, Red Canyon is open to the public, accessible through regulated hiking routes. Visitors walk its winding corridors every season without noticing anything unusual at all. The rock looks natural. The ridges look consistent. The canyon, to anyone standing in it, looks complete. But pull up the archival overlays that historical geospatial researchers still use to compare old surveys against new ones, and there's a faint, stubborn discrepancy along the northern ridge, a subtle mismatch between Mercer's 1874 field reconstruction and the canyon as it's mapped today. It isn't large enough to suggest some hidden alternate landscape sitting just out of view, but it's large enough that, more than a century later, no one has ever managed to fully reconcile the two data sets. Somewhere inside that gap is the question Mercer was likely trying to answer the afternoon he split off from his expedition and walked alone toward the northern ridge. What was he actually mapping that required a page to disappear from history? Maybe the answer was never meant to survive in any official record. Or maybe it still does. Misfiled, miscategorized, sitting in some archive box nobody has pulled down in decades, waiting on a researcher patient enough to keep looking after everyone else has stopped. Because in cases like this, the evidence that matters most is rarely the evidence that got destroyed. It's the evidence someone took the time to remove, carefully, deliberately, before anyone else could understand why it mattered. Elias Mercer's final page isn't simply missing. It's unaccounted for. And in the strictest, most literal sense of the term, that means his case was never actually closed. It was just set down quietly by people who already knew the answer they weren't ready to put on a map, and left, like the canyon itself, for someone else to find.